I'm Petra Davidson, he's Glenn Shark, and this is Becoming Ransomware-proof. We're done. Not too long ago, those words came out of the mouth of a CEO of a company who'd been hit by ransomware. And he, like any good CEO, jumped on a call with the Panzura support team to make sure that we understood just how serious this was for their organization. He said, we can withstand maybe a few days without access to our data, but after that, we're done. We like you guys, but we can't be your customer because we're not going to have a company in a few months' time. It's this serious. This is all of our production data. Our people can't work. We're going to miss the deadlines. We're going to be penalized for missing the project. We won't get cyber insurance any longer. We can't pay our people, all the things. This is incredibly serious for us. And that's the reality every single day for organizations all around the world. So Statista's got some very recent stats on this. They monitor this year. And 59% of organizations they found across the world had been victims of a ransomware attack just in 2024 alone, and just at the start of 2024 alone. That's phenomenally serious. And what it means is the odds are in favor at being you. Now, here's the thing to know. IT leaders that we speak to often think that they're in a field that isn't a likely target for ransomware. They're not in healthcare, for example. They don't have information that is incredibly desirable to ransomware attackers, or at least not in their eyes. But that's not the way attackers see it. These attacks come across the board, and all that matters to them is that the data that they encrypt matters to you. It doesn't matter whether it matters to the rest of the world. So let's take a look at what cyber attacks really look like. You can see that ransomware is by far and away the biggest threat that you face. Network breaches give you a sizable percentage there, but at over 70%, ransomware is your problem. You'll also see at the upper left, there's a data exfiltration of 1.3%. Now that often goes hand in hand with ransomware. Here, Statista's broken out separately, but generally speaking, you can gang that in with ransomware, and so it's part of the over 70%. These things can and do bring businesses to a halt. Next thing to understand is that you can spend all the money and all the resources that you want on your defenses, and you should be putting money into those defenses. However, it doesn't seem like it's possible to make that impenetrable. And there are a few reasons for that. Your attack surface is absolutely enormous. And so defending it all is expensive, and you're probably still going to miss something. And the reason for that is often that your people have devices everywhere, and a lot of devices have access into your network. Attacks are very, very difficult to detect. So the tendency now is not just for a brute force attack. These attacks start very, very slowly. They sniff around for files for an initial while, and they run in the background, and they exfiltrate files before they do the encryption. And that's so there's a double leverage for you. So the event that you were able to roll back to a backup, they still want to be able to say, we're holding this data hostage and we're going to release it publicly and embarrass you if you don't pay us some money. The next thing to know is that the value is in your files. And so while ransomware attacks aim to take out as many of your systems as possible, they often focus on the files first. And the aim of this is to make it as difficult and as slow as possible for you to be able to get back to clean data so that it seems like it's less expensive for you to simply pay a ransom and hopefully get an encryption key to recover that data. So what does your survival depend on? There's 4 things. You have to minimize the risk of your data being exposed, and that means blocking exfiltration to the greatest extent possible. It depends on your ability to recover clean data and to reduce data loss while you're doing it. So remember that recovering from a that's a week old means a considerable amount of data loss, and that puts a dent in your productivity. And the last thing that's critically important is how long it takes you to do all of these things. There's a lot of data, some of it published very recently, that show that organizations, all as good IT organizations do, have SLAs for recovery time, and they're based on the amount of time, the time that they can stand to be without their data. It's also very obvious that those SLAs are largely theoretical. When organizations are hit with ransomware, it takes them an extraordinary amount of time to recover. And so quite often organizations are not missing their SLAs by hours, they're missing them by days and weeks, and sometimes even months to get all of their data back. And so do not underestimate the risk that you face, even if you think that you're not in an industry that is one of the largest targets. That does not mean that tomorrow or even today won't be the day. So why is it so difficult to keep ransomware out and to avoid paying ransoms? It all comes back to vulnerability and complexity. So you run antivirus, as you should, often misses ransomware. You have an extra vulnerability because most file systems are made to allow files to be edited, to be changed. You can put in seams. They're all reactive. They don't tell you what's coming. They help you respond to it once it's happened. Traditional backups are not granular whatsoever. That means that you're backing up a lot of data on a regular schedule. And that also means that restoring that data is very, very slow. Data has gravity. And so when you have to restore terabytes, it takes time. And everyone is a target. There is nothing to be lost by attackers from going after small firms. Quite often those small firms are richer targets because they don't have the resources to defend themselves. But you can see in the news, some of the organizations being hit and even paying ransoms are very, very large and very well resourced. And so what do you do about this? Because this is not just a storage problem and it's not just a security problem. And so it's become obvious that what used to be 2 different practice areas have to come together. It is no longer enough for security to try and be safe and storage to do its best with backups. And so what does that look like? So fairly recently, the National Institute of Standards and Technology has started looking at their cybersecurity framework that they apply to other things and applying that to storage. And this covers these areas you can see on the screen here: govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. All of those things are necessary to keep your organization safe. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to run through each of these areas and talk about what that looks like for Panzura customers and how important it is to be able to comprehensively have a plan in place to deal with each of these. Now, before I hand over to Glenn, there's a concept that we're going to introduce you to, and it's immutability. Now, you're familiar with immutability when it comes to backup data. Tape, for example, is an excellent example of immutable data. Once you put data onto tape, that is your cold storage, you are not going to be changing that data. However, you can work with immutable data in an active file system. So for the files that you're working on in the here and now, that works, and that works with Panzura. Glenn, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks. For NIST to govern, and this is going to be the truest statement from a storage vendor that you'll get on this webinar or any webinar. It is an order. It is multiple orders of magnitude less expensive for you to train your user base and have the user base understand the policies around cybersecurity than it is to buy a SIM or implement any kind of other security measure like firewalls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Training your user base on not clicking the links, informing them of what the expectations are for them from the usage of internal resources, communicating that. And then the part where we can begin to help is monitoring that is the most important thing. It's going to cost companies maybe 4 figures to do an internal class that is actually useful on the governance associated with using the technology. It's going to cost 7 figures to recover or pay a ransom. So one is definitely going to be better than the other. Around that, where storage vendors are starting to go is this Gartner concept of cyber storage. So you can feel free to look that up. And of course, Panzura is part of that cyber storage group. And we cover every component of the NIST CSF, or the cybersecurity framework. How we address govern is 2 ways. The first I already mentioned is alerting, right? So as an administrator, you can set up alerts around what your users are doing and the environment in general. So within Panzura Data Services, we have a full suite of alerting for you. We'll come back to this when it comes to audit alerting for data exfiltration. Other things that you can do as part of the training is self-service. As most of you know what VSS is, the ability to recover or roll back to a previous incarnation of that individual file. So companies have started VSS and enabling their users to just automatically bring back previous files. As Petra said, our file system is immutable. So just because the user is reverting back to a previous file utilizing VSS doesn't mean that the new version of that file isn't still there, right? Because every incarnation of that file is available. So when you click on that as an option in Windows, you'll see a lot of different versions and every single change that is done on the back end system to that file. And that is done using snapshotting technology. We've just integrated it with Microsoft's VSS. So that's govern. On to identify. So from an identification standpoint, the organization needs to know what risks there are. And there's really the 3 that are listed here. The biggest risk to your company is in the exfiltration of the data, right? Assuming after this webinar, you watch it and you go, I'm going to become a Panzura customer. I'm not going to be able to get hit by ransomware, and it's going to solve all my problems. Nope, it's not, right? Because the concern is around exfiltration first and foremost, which is why Panzura not only has CloudFS, which is an immutable file system, but we also offer Panzura Data Service and Rescue, which will enable that audit capability to ensure that once data starts the exfiltration process, you're going to become aware of that as quickly as is humanly possible, because that is your biggest soft spot. Even though the stats that Petra showed a few slides ago showed only 1% of data X 2023, that has ramped up significantly as the biggest concern for 2025. The folks that are making ransomware figured out that companies are starting to use immutable storage, and they can recover from any encryption damage. But what they can't recover from is the embarrassment of having all of their data exposed. And that goes hand in hand with governance. If you do end up with your data exposed, and that is PII, PHI data, that is also company ending potentially. If not really embarrassing, or the government fines you, depending on the size of the company, the government starts fining you 8 figures plus, right? So the last bit is damage. And CloudFS has been around for 17 years, and Panzura has been around for 17 years as a company, utilizing object stores on the back end and ensuring that our customers' data is immutable and is not susceptible to the type of damage that we're talking about today. And honestly, just because we're on this side, that is the least of our concerns. All of our technology going forward is around ensuring that there's minimized exfiltration, that there's minimized impact to your governance and to your company from a losing your data standpoint and having it exposed to the real world. On to protect. So what is CloudFS doing to protect your data? It's quite a lot. We protect your data in flight, protect your data at rest, and we make sure that your data is available for recovery. So we're going to be talking about that. First and foremost, we are the only company within our space, for now at least, that has the FIPS 140-3 certification. So we have been historically NIST FIPS 140-2. That is a sunsetted certification, and we have re-upped as of the beginning of this year, end of last year, to FIPS 140-3, and it takes a couple of years to go through it. So this is military-grade encryption, and we have passed the NIST certification for that. So let's talk about what CloudFS is doing to ensure that your data is safe at rest. Snapshotting. Snapshotting isn't the traditional NAS snapshots that you know and love for the past 30 years. They've always been a point in time, and they've been deltas that you can revert back to. But this is another level of immutability, right? So every change and every delta within your organization, right, when it's written to CloudFS, becomes its own effective point in time for that file. One would call that file versioning, which generally has a negative connotation when exposed to the user. But on our back end, we're keeping track of every version and every change to that file, so that not if, but when you get hit with ransomware there in the middle, a new encryption will happen to that file, right? So if you look at the top of that center section, let's say it's a PowerPoint file that initially got created, and then you change some graphics, then you change some text, and you kept hitting save, 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 and that's great. Then the next day, it gets hit with ransomware. So that encryption of the entire file becomes its own delta, right? So all you have to do is go to the previous point in time prior to encryption for just that file, and you've recovered the file. We can do this on a file level. We can do this on a file system level. If you know, like if you've had total file system encryption, and you know exactly the time that it hit, and you know that no other files that were changed prior to being encrypted, let's say it happens at 2 a.m. when no one was online, then you can just revert the entire file system. Really straightforward. But we can also do a more bespoke recovery on a file-by-file basis if you are only partially encrypted. So you can work with the Panzura team, as that one customer did, and we can figure out together when you got hit with encryption, what files were changed at that time, and then do one-by-one recoveries, so that, let's say, some other files that didn't get encrypted that are super important with new data don't go back to that point in time. So you have to reinvent that wheel. So the choices are plentiful, right? We can do an entire file system recovery to the exactly minute before you were encrypted, or we can do file by file bespoke recovery. and that's part of our services. The next thing that we do is mirroring. And we do this in two different ways. The first way that we've done mirroring is with the cloud mirroring feature that was released now over a year ago. The way that the CloudFS system works is there is a primary object store. So there is a single source of truth for the entire file system, and everybody writes to that. In real time, with cloud mirroring enabled, there is a secondary object store. The primary you can put in one hyperscaler, and the secondary is recommended that you put into a second hyperscaler to ensure that, let's say, the admin of your AWS infrastructure, if they got compromised and they deleted the object store, they don't have the admin rights to the secondary, and you can just recover straight from that, right? So everything would fail over to the secondary. Your secondary becomes the primary. It could be something inexpensive like a Wasabi or a Seagate Live Cloud or something like that, because the hope is that you never use it. What we've introduced recently is the concept of a regional store, which can act as a secondary object store in the back end. And we support up to 4 regional stores global, but the write operations are different. All right, so we would use the back-end syncing capability of AWS, for example, to sync the object store to different regions, right? And if one region fails, you fail over to the other, but they're all active. So if you have one in US West and one in EMEA, the folks in EMEA will use that object store, and the folks in the US would use the one in US West. So we have several levels of high availability available for our customer base to ensure that if you do end up encrypted, right, you can recover the file system, but if you end up with a compromised internal admin that decides to delete an object store, or that region simply goes down, you have multiple ways to fail over to secondary and tertiary object stores. The nice thing about the secondary and the tertiary and the fourth one is that they also offer localized performance. So there are ways to mirror the entire system and ensure that there is no chance for your entire CloudFS environment to get gone. Because what happens with our immutable file system is that a lot of our customers no longer do backups to tape. So they need to make sure that they have a secondary object store, and that there's, again, no single login by a single person that could be disgruntled one day and just basically take everything out altogether. Now let's move on to NIST Detect. Detection of ransomware is hard in general. And you have SIMs that are very reactionary, right? They can detect it after the fact. And since those are third-party systems, it's going to take them longer to detect ransomware than the primary system. So what Panzura has done is created Panzura Data Services Detect and Rescue. We know what ransomware looks like when it hits our system. We're going to detect it substantially faster than any third party. We know what we look like from an IO perspective when we're beginning to encrypt ourselves, right? So when that process occurs, an immediate red flag is waved. You get a lot fewer false positives from our own system than you would from any third-party SIM or a Varonis or anything like that. And then the rescue part is we know when we're being encrypted, so we can recover it very quickly. We can also provide alerting, right? So with alerting to the admin, we want to make sure that is as intelligent as possible. And this is in the NIST Respond category. So that alerting to the admin will not only tell you that we've detected a threat, but what the response should be from a bring the file system back, right? File by file or a whole file system, but also an alert around data exfiltration. And we're going to do this in 2 steps. The first data exfil alert that we have, and that's available today, is within audit alerts. And with audit alerts, the admin is going to set the thresholds for all the users. And I can give a simple example. I'm a VP at this company. Petra's my boss. She knows I really don't do anything on a daily basis. So I maybe touch 3, 4, 5 files a day. If all of a sudden I'm touching 100 files, I mean, even 20 files, it's half a miracle. That means I put in more than an hour of work that day. Someone should get an alert. Yeah, someone should get an alert. Glenn's working. It's probably that I'm exfiltrating the data, right? And so you're going to need to put thresholds on what that looks like within your environment, and then you're going to get an alert, and there's a possibility of a few false positives, but having a few false positives is way better than all of your data leaving the building. The next step, and as a watcher of this webinar, you're going to get a little bit of early roadmap information, is our implementation of AI. And we'll be using AI to basically gauge every individual user of the CloudFS file system. And it's going to know I only touch 5 files, but since Petra puts in a full day's work, she probably touches 30, and 5 is normal for me, 30 is normal for her. But if she's touching 100, she's probably also exfiltrating data, and somebody should get an alert around that. So our next incarnation of Panzura Data Services around detect and rescue will have an AI component that comes with the offering that allows you to gauge every single user and provide a baseline for what they do, and then send alerts. So hopefully there'll be fewer false positives, and then allow for much quicker recovery, as is covered here. There's a lot of ways that we can recover. And that we talked about a few of them, right? We can do granular file by file. We can do entire file system recoveries. We can recover the entire object store if you're using mirroring, or if you're using our regional store function, recovery there. And as the folks that have watched some of our webinars know, we're splitting metadata from data, right? And that metadata sits at every one of our CloudFS nodes. But more importantly, it also sits within the object store. A clean copy of the metadata of the entire file system is essentially backed up to the object store itself, which means that any failures or encryption of the CloudFS nodes, because keep in mind that those are just file systems, right? They are also susceptible to being hit with some kind of ransomware or encryption or malware. So if one of those goes down, you can actually recover that entire CloudFS node from the object store, right? You can bring that metadata back. And we also have high availability capabilities, as well as instant node, which was released in the last, to bring those CloudFS nodes back very quickly without having an active passive system, which tends to be expensive. And then one more thing. You can save money, right? Showing this kind of preparedness and complying with NIST CSF is going to become more and more important to your insurance providers, right? You can actually save money on cyber insurance if you make your own SLAs, right? Most companies that we worked with say, yeah, we should be able to recover in a day, and they don't, right? They can't recover at all. So they move to us, and then they can show that their cyber insurance vendors that they can recover within minutes. They can mimic a failure and show what recovery looks like. And so when you comply with every component of the CSF framework, your insurance provider will not view you as someone that is highly susceptible, like the other 60%, to being hit with ransomware, and then you can recover very simply. Petra, do you want to go over this one, the whole offering?
Sure. Okay, so what we've covered here is predominantly with the core of the hybrid cloud file platform, which is Panzura CloudFS. All of the things that you see on the left-hand side of this diagram are included with CloudFS. So it helps you firstly with your cloud file migration. Now, essentially, that means you're using an object store, and you can see down the bottom, that can be public cloud, private cloud, or it can be on-prem. It's entirely up to you. As we do that migration, we're consolidating distributed data and we're stripping out duplicate blocks. Glenn touched on a little earlier how we translate files into blocks, and we're looking at moving duplicated blocks out of that, so they never come into the file system, and give you a great reduction in the volume of data that you're storing. You get your global file distribution, and that's fast enough to give you cross-site collaboration around the world if you need it. And so your users can effectively work like they're all in the same room, working off a NAS that has locally stored data, and you get the same sort of performant file operations as you do when everybody's in the same building. We make your data immutable, as Glenn's discussed. The snapshots themselves are also immutable, and that's important. There's no point in having immutable data if your snapshots can be damaged and you're not able to restore to those precise points in time. You get military-grade encryption. Cloud mirroring comes with an additional license. And of course, you have the cost of your object store itself. Panzura Data Services is required for some of the things that we touched on. In particular, that's where your ransomware tracker would sit. It also gives you the ability to search for files that have been damaged, follow the audit trail for files that have been damaged, investigate the users, and help with your compliance efforts. And then finally, Panzura Detect and Rescue gives you that detection in real time in a live file system, which is difficult, by the way, to run without impacting file operations, and be precise enough that you can detect at a high level of confidence without giving you a lot of false positives. That also interdicts attacks at a very granular level, and the most granular level is the user level. This again is important. Some other systems you'll find will interdict at a far more disruptive level. So they might interdict at a location level, which isn't really necessary, particularly if they're prone to having some false positives. What you need to do is stop the attack, and that means disabling the user account that's been infiltrated. And that's it. So each of these are subject to a separate license, but with the core of Panzura Cloud FS, you get the majority of these features that will help you to become incredibly resilient and to keep your business running. And that's what we've got today. Now, we're here when you're ready. If you have any questions at all as a result of what you've heard here or as a result of any other of our webinars, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can head to panzura.com. We've got a contact form, or just email panzura@panzura.com, and we'll be here to help.